Soon after taking control of the government, Mugabe surprised everyone, especially the frightened remaining whites, by applying a calm, conciliatory approach towards his former rivals. Many individuals who had been his enemies, including Ian Smith, remarked on how polite and reasonable he seemed as he invited them round to his offices to chat. For a while, considerable optimism surrounded the new multiracial government of Zimbabwe, and other countries were falling over themselves to provide support and aid for the young democracy. However, cracks in the veneer started to show as relations with neighbouring South Africa became more abrasive. Apartheid South Africa, still clinging to white minority rule, suddenly found itself hemmed in along its northern borders by 3 communist countries, including Mozambique and Angola, all of which promoted the cause of black nationalism. Feeling uncomfortable with this arrangement, the South African Defence Force began a surreptitious campaign of sabotage in Zimbabwe, with the aim of keeping the country unstable and defensive. The series of bomb blasts and the networks of espionage fueled Mugabe's underlying suspicions of a conspiracy between South African and Zimbabwean whites against him, convinced of their intent to overthrow his government. As his paranoia increased, his attitude towards Zimbabwean whites grew colder and more abrasive, while his leanings towards a one-party state style of government became more compelling. Before long, he had abandoned his espoused policies of national reconciliation and started to forcefully extinguish any hints of opposition. For the first time, he started talking publicly about his use of torture and about his disregard for legal procedures that interfered with his actions. Mugabe made a secret deal with North Korea to train a special military unit that became known as the 5th Brigade. After training, they were sent into Matabeleland and are said to have unleashed a devastating campaign of beatings, rape and mass murder upon the civilian population there. Described as an attempted genocide against the Ndebele people, reports of civilian deaths are between 10 and 20,000. Mugabe has always refused to fully acknowledge this event, even in the face of mounting evidence of the atrocities committed. Some commentators believe that he is fearful of being hauled in front of an international human rights tribunal should he ever lose his grip on power, which is one of the reasons why he clings to it so tenaciously. In the midst of this climate of distrust was the issue of land redistribution. The land issue had been a thorn in the side of Zimbabwe since its earliest days, when the British colonisers first arrived at the end of the 19th century and carved out all of the best quality land for themselves, regardless of the black communities that were currently living on it. With another election on the horizon in 1990 and such a poor record of land redistribution to show, Mugabe announced a new, more radical plan. Without consulting anybody, he gave the government the power to confiscate land and pay whatever they wanted for it, and prohibited any appeals from white farmers through the courts. Over the next decade, land seizures became large-scale and increasingly violent. Gangs of so-called war veterans and unemployed youths were paid to go out and seize white-owned farms. Beatings, rapes and soon murders were carried out on an almost daily basis. As the agricultural sector went into freefall, white businesses were then targeted, and even international humanitarian agencies stationed in Zimbabwe were ransacked and robbed. Spawned from the deepening crisis, a new centre of opposition had formed from a coalition of trade unionists, civil society groups and academics, which became known as the Movement for Democratic Change. This party has become the main opposition to Mugabe's ZANU-PF and contested the elections in 2000 and 2005, both of which were marred by accusations of rigging and brutal intimidation by Mugabe's party. Which brings us to the current crisis, the outcome of the 2008 parliamentary and presidential elections. The results of the presidential election, over a month since the poll was taken, has still not been released. Meanwhile, a partial recount of the parliamentary elections have almost been completed, and they confirm the original results, which show that for the first time since Zimbabwe's independence, the ZANU-PF party has lost its majority in parliament. The entire electoral process has been condemned by both the MDC and international observers as being decisively flawed, with delays deliberately orchestrated by Mugabe to cook the results in his favour. Meanwhile, he has unleashed a campaign of terror and intimidation across the country against anyone who he suspects may sympathise with the opposition, as he becomes increasingly desperate to cling to power at any cost. In response to food shortages, unemployment and escalating harassment, over 5 million Zimbabwean people have fled their country, and at least 3 million of them are in South Africa. The Southern African Development Community have appointed the President of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, as the official mediator with Mugabe, but he has been heavily criticised for his soft approach towards the dictator, especially when he recently announced that he did not consider the situation in Zimbabwe a crisis. Observers point to the historical ties of loyalty that exist between the two from the days of the liberation struggle, when Mugabe was seen as a hero among African people. However, the US, the UK, Europe and even other African countries are becoming increasingly vocal in their criticism of the situation.
No one thinks, having seen the results at polling stations, that President Mugabe has won this election. A stolen election would not be a democratic election at all.
And international demands for a speedy resolution to the problem are getting louder. Mugabe truly believes that if he lost power, Zimbabwe would somehow have lost the revolution against white rule. He seems convinced that Britain and the West are seeking to recolonise his country, and that he is the only person standing in their way. After 28 years of despotic rule, Mugabe is truly addicted to power, and has proven time and again that he is willing to punish and even kill his own people in order to retain that power. But the tide is turning, and it finally seems like the people of Zimbabwe have had enough. If they can survive the bullying, poverty and starvation with which they have been afflicted, there might be a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, a chance to rebuild Zimbabwe under a new leadership in a climate of freedom, fairness and good governance. Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu sums it up best.
Despite all appearances to the contrary, it is a moral universe that in the end good prevails.